With the assassination of President William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, not quite 43, became the 26th and youngest president in the nation's history, 1901 to 1909. He brought new excitement and power to the office, vigorously leading Congress and the American public toward progressive reforms and a strong foreign policy. With the assassination of President McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, not quite 43, became the youngest president in the nation's history. He brought new excitement and power to the presidency, as he vigorously led Congress and the American public toward progressive reforms and a strong foreign policy. He took the view that the president as a steward of the people should take whatever action necessary for the public good unless expressly forbidden by law or the Constitution. "I did not usurp power," he wrote, "but I did greatly broaden the use of executive power." Roosevelt's youth differed sharply from that of the log cabin presidents. He was born in New York City in 1858 into a wealthy family, but he too struggled, against ill health, and in his triumph became an advocate of the strenuous life. In 1884 his first wife, Alice Lee Roosevelt, and his mother died on the same day. Roosevelt spent much of the next 2 years on his ranch in the Badlands of Dakota Territory. There he mastered his sorrow as he lived in the saddle, driving cattle, hunting big game. He even captured an outlaw. On a visit to London, he married Edith Carew in December 1886. During the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt was lieutenant colonel of the Rough Rider Regiment, which he led on a charge at the Battle of San Juan. He was one of the most conspicuous heroes of the war. Boss Tom Platt, needing a hero to draw attention away from scandals in New York State, accepted Roosevelt as the Republican candidate for governor in 1898. Roosevelt won and served with distinction. As president, Roosevelt held the ideal that the government should be the great arbiter of the conflicting economic forces in the nation, especially between capital and labor, guaranteeing justice to each and dispensing favors to none. Roosevelt emerged spectacularly as a trust buster by forcing the dissolution of a great railroad combination in the Northwest. Other antitrust suits under the Sherman Act followed. Roosevelt steered the United States more actively into world politics. He liked to quote a favorite proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Aware of the strategic need for a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific, Roosevelt ensured the construction of the Panama Canal. His corollary to the Monroe Doctrine prevented the establishment of foreign bases in the Caribbean and arrogated the sole right of intervention in Latin America to the United States. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the Russo-Japanese War, reached a gentleman's agreement on immigration with Japan, and sent the Great White Fleet on a goodwill tour of the world. Some of Theodore Roosevelt's most effective achievements were in conservation. He added enormously to the national forests in the West, reserved lands for public use, and fostered great irrigation projects. He crusaded endlessly on matters big and small, exciting audiences with his high-pitched voice, jutting jaw, and pounding fist. The life of strenuous endeavor was a must for those around him, as he romped with his 5 younger children and led ambassadors on hikes through Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. Leaving the presidency in 1909, Roosevelt went on an African safari, then jumped back into politics. In 1912 he ran for president on a progressive ticket. To reporters he once remarked that he felt as fit as a bull moose, the name of his new party. While campaigning in Milwaukee, he was shot in the chest by a fanatic. Roosevelt soon recovered, but his words at that time would have been applicable at the time of his death in 1919, "No man has had a happier life than I have led, a happier life in every way." Theodore Roosevelt Jr., October 27, 1858 to January 6, 1919, often referred to as Teddy or TR, was an American politician, soldier, conservationist, historian, naturalist, explorer, and writer who served as the 26th President of the United States from 1901 to 1909. He previously was involved in New York politics, including serving as the state's 33rd governor for 2 years. He was the vice president under President William McKinley for 6 months in 1901, assuming the presidency after McKinley's assassination. As president, Roosevelt emerged as a leader of the Republican Party and became a driving force for antitrust and progressive policies. A sickly child with debilitating asthma, Roosevelt overcame health problems through a strenuous lifestyle. He integrated his exuberant personality and a range of interests and achievements into a cowboy persona defined by robust masculinity. He was homeschooled and began a lifelong naturalist avocation before attending Harvard College. His book The Naval War of 1812 established his reputation as a historian and popular writer. Roosevelt became the leader of the reform faction of Republicans in the New York State Legislature. His first wife and mother died on the same night, devastating him psychologically. He recuperated by buying and operating a cattle ranch in the Dakotas. Roosevelt served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley, and in 1898 helped plan the successful naval war against Spain. He resigned to help form and lead the Rough Riders, a unit that fought the Spanish army in Cuba to great publicity. Returning a war hero, Roosevelt was elected New York's governor in 1898. The New York State Party leadership disliked his ambitious agenda and convinced McKinley to choose him as his running mate in the 1900 presidential election. The McKinley-Roosevelt ticket won a landslide victory based on a platform of victory, peace, and prosperity. Roosevelt assumed the presidency aged 42, and is the youngest person to become U.S. president. As a leader of the progressive movement, he championed his square deal domestic policies, which called for fairness for all citizens, breaking bad trusts, regulating railroads, and pure food and drugs. Roosevelt prioritized conservation and established national parks, forests, and monuments to preserve America's natural resources. In foreign policy, he focused on Central America, beginning construction of the Panama Canal. Roosevelt expanded the Navy and sent the Great White Fleet on a world tour to project naval power. His successful efforts to end the Russo-Japanese War won him the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize, the first American to win a Nobel Prize. Roosevelt was elected to a full term in 1904 and promoted policies to the left, despite opposition from Republican leaders. He groomed his ally William Howard Taft to succeed him in 1908. Roosevelt grew frustrated with Taft's conservatism and tried, and failed, to win the 1912 Republican presidential nomination. He founded the New Progressive Party and ran in 1912. The split allowed the Democratic Woodrow Wilson to win. Roosevelt led a 4-month expedition to the Amazon basin, where he nearly died of tropical disease. During World War I, he criticized Wilson for keeping the U.S. out. His offer to lead volunteers to France was rejected. Roosevelt's health deteriorated and he died in 1919. Polls of historians and political scientists rank him as one of the greatest American presidents. On September 6, 1901, President McKinley was attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, when he was shot by anarchist Leon Czolgosz. Roosevelt was vacationing in Isle La Motte, Vermont, and traveled to Buffalo to visit McKinley in the hospital. It appeared that McKinley would recover, so Roosevelt resumed his vacation in the Adirondack Mountains. When McKinley's condition worsened, Roosevelt again rushed back to Buffalo. McKinley died on September 14, and Roosevelt was informed while he was in North Creek. He continued on to Buffalo and was sworn in as the nation's 26th president at the Ansley Wilcox House. McKinley's supporters were nervous about the new president, and Ohio Senator Mark Hanna was particularly bitter that the man he had opposed so vigorously at the convention had succeeded McKinley. Roosevelt assured party leaders that he intended to adhere to McKinley's policies, and he retained McKinley's cabinet. Nonetheless, Roosevelt sought to position himself as the party's undisputed leader, seeking to bolster the role of the president and position himself for the 1904 election. Shortly after taking office, Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House. This sparked a bitter, and at times vicious, reaction among whites across the heavily segregated South. Roosevelt reacted with astonishment and protest, saying that he looked forward to many future dinners with Washington. Upon further reflection, Roosevelt wanted to ensure that this had no effect on political support in the White South, and further dinner invitations to Washington were avoided. Their next meeting was scheduled as typical business at 10 a.m. instead. Roosevelt enjoyed being president and was still relatively youthful, but felt limited terms provided a check against dictatorship. Roosevelt decided to stick to his 1904 pledge not to run for a third term. He favored Secretary of State Elihu Root as his successor, but Root's ill health made him unsuitable. New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes was a strong candidate and shared Roosevelt's progressivism, but Roosevelt disliked him and considered him too independent. Roosevelt settled on his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. Roosevelt and Taft had been friends since 1890, and Taft had consistently supported Roosevelt's policies. Roosevelt was determined to install the successor of his choice, and wrote to Taft, "Dear Will, do you want any action about those federal officials? I will break their necks with the utmost cheerfulness if you say the word." Just weeks later he branded as false and malicious the charge he was using the offices at his disposal to favor Taft. At the 1908 Republican Convention, many chanted 4 years more of a Roosevelt presidency, but Taft won the nomination after Henry Cabot Lodge made it clear Roosevelt was not interested. On October 14, 1912, while arriving at a campaign event in Milwaukee, Roosevelt was shot in front of the Gilpatrick Hotel by delusional saloonkeeper John Schrank, who believed the ghost of assassinated President William McKinley had directed him to kill Roosevelt. The bullet lodged in his chest after penetrating his steel eyeglass case and passing through a 50-page single-folded copy of the speech titled "Progressive Cause Greater Than Any Individual." Schrank was disarmed and captured by Roosevelt's stenographer, Albert E. Martin, as he attempted to fire a second time, and might have been lynched had Roosevelt not shouted for Schrank to remain unharmed. Roosevelt assured the crowd he was all right, then ordered police to take Schrank and make sure no violence was done to him. As an experienced hunter and anatomist, Roosevelt correctly concluded that since he was not coughing blood, the bullet had not reached his lung. He declined suggestions to go to hospital immediately and instead delivered a 90-minute speech with blood seeping into his shirt. Only afterwards did he accept medical attention. Probes and an X-ray showed the bullet had lodged in Roosevelt's chest muscle, but did not penetrate the pleura. Doctors concluded it would be less dangerous to leave it than attempt to remove it, and Roosevelt carried the bullet in him for the rest of his life. Taft and Democratic nominee Woodrow Wilson suspended their campaigning until Roosevelt resumed his. When asked if the shooting would affect his election campaign, he said to the reporter, "I'm fit as a bull moose." The bull moose became a symbol of Roosevelt and the Progressive Party, and it often was referred to as the Bull Moose Party. He spent 2 weeks recuperating before returning to campaign. He wrote a friend about the bullet, "I do not mind it any more than if it were in my waistcoat pocket." As a reward, Roosevelt sent Schrank's gun to Martin, along with the spent bullet casing, 5 bullets, and a gold watch inscribed, "To Albert E. Martin from Theodore Roosevelt in remembrance of October 14, 1912. On the night of January 5, 1919, Roosevelt suffered breathing problems. After receiving treatment from his physician, George W. Fowler, he felt better and went to bed. Roosevelt's last words were, "Please put out that light, James," to his family servant James E. Amos. Between 4 o'clock and 4:15 the next morning, Roosevelt died at the age of 60 in his sleep at Sagamore Hill of a blood clot in his lungs. Upon receiving word of his death, his son Archibald telegraphed his siblings, "The old lion is dead." Woodrow Wilson's vice president, Thomas R. Marshall, said that death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight. Following a private farewell service in the North Room at Sagamore Hill, a simple funeral was held at Christ Episcopal Church in Oyster Bay. Vice President Thomas R. Marshall, Charles Evans Hughes, Warren G. Harding, Henry Cabot Lodge, and William Howard Taft were among the mourners. The snow-covered procession route to Young's Memorial Cemetery was lined with spectators and a squad of mounted policemen who had ridden from New York City. Roosevelt was buried on a hillside overlooking Oyster Bay. Thank you for watching this video.